Welcome into the Make Your Money Matter show. I'm Brad Barrett. Today on our show, we're going to talk about the solution to the retirement evolution. Try to say that 5 times fast. So let me pose a question for you in starting today's show. Are you prepared for the ever-changing landscape that is retirement? You may be thinking, Brad, what does that even mean? I thought retirement's just, that way for everybody. So we're going to talk about that today because it has actually changed and you need to be ready. No matter if you're in your 20s or in your 60s right now, this matters for you. But before we get started, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get into it. So I want to say something on the onset of our show today, that retirement is for everyone. The word retirement in general, just remember, for us is not necessarily you need to be 65 years old. It's just when you want to become financially free from working per se. And retirement in the past was actually, if you look at history, was actually a much shorter time period, but it could potentially, for you, be much, much longer. So for many of us watching and listening here, it could be almost half your life. And I'll explain that in a second. So that question here for all of us is, how do you plan for that? We're going to address that today. Now, when looking at that though, for me being a financial advisor of nearly 2 decades and all the anecdotal and experience-based evidence from being a retirement planner for thousands of clients, it's become clear to me that our forefathers, if you want to go back that far, never really entertained the notion of retirement as we understand it today. And I suspect that the concept to them of retirement would actually seem somewhat unnatural, right? And for many of us watching, maybe in your 60s or 70s, imagine your grandfather talking about retirement, you know what I mean? And think about it in the context of today. Yet here we are in an era where retirement is not just a possibility, but a widely anticipated and meticulously planned stage of your life. But as you can probably imagine, this transformation as we see it today didn't happen overnight. It was an evolution. And it has a lot to do with things like societal shifts, economic developments, and really, I think the extension, which we're going to talk about today, is life expectancy. And actually, there was an article I was reading over the weekend on Kiplinger that I found really anecdotal to what I wanted to share and was on my heart already as a topic for this week. And it was interesting because I was thinking about this, and as I was looking up and doing some research, this article came up, and I loved how the article went through and some of the thoughts I'm going to share here as it relates to this article, because we all know that for us to look at tomorrow, we have to take stock in what happened yesterday. In other words, looking back to see forward. So I mentioned things like societal shifts, economic developments, life expectancies increasing. These are all part of this, but going way back for a second, in ancient societies, people worked. As we probably know this, based on history lessons, they worked day in and day out to provide for, and by the way, some still do today, but the difference between then and now is I think where our focus needs to be, because back then people worked in trades that provided for their daily needs. Think farming, think agriculture, think things like that. And it required ongoing attention and effort. There wasn't a whole lot stored for the next day. Now, fast forward a little bit from ancient times to not that long ago, maybe a few hundred years ago, we have the Industrial Revolution, which kind of kicked off around the 1700s. And you started seeing people from that point moving from fields to factories, really from a work perspective, and working for companies versus themselves or their homesteads. Then all of a sudden, you started seeing the migration of the actual people working and living in cities as well. Now, fast forward another 100 years or so to the late 1800s, and now you see this societal shift from families and communities working together and really supporting one another to now having industrial and corporate jobs. And that often took people away from their homes and required a different method for things like social reform, even supporting elderly people back then. And for many of our families still today, we support our family internally. We lean on other things though today, like Social Security, Medicare. We have those things now. They didn't have that back then. It's a very different structure here as you talk about retirement. Again, the evolution in the changing environments is what I'm getting to, okay? Now, fast forward again for a second, and I'll get off the history here for a second, but again, looking backwards to look forwards here, you fast forward to the 1900s. We see now the introduction of a social reform system, Social Security in the 1930s. And I think this, friends, this shift there in the 30s, in 1935 and the New Deal, it marked a departure from a model that placed personal responsibility on the family and the community. And all of a sudden, now you're putting that responsibility on the government. And we all know that change happens, but it happens pretty fast. And this is all in the last 250 years. So not that I'm saying everyone's going to live here for 250 years to life expectancy, but it happens pretty fast and in pretty small chunks. So we should recognize the speed of change that has occurred. And again, as I said before, retirement as a concept is interesting because our forefathers didn't exactly see it how we see it now. This Jimmy Buffett, Tommy Bahama, Margaritaville, laying on your bed or sitting on your porch, sipping a Mai Tai with your feet up. That's the kind of cliche retirement that we're subliminally marketed to, right? But that's not what was actually thought about hundreds of years ago. I mean, we saw in the early 2000s the baby boomers retiring, and you saw birth rates declining and the labor force actually shrinking. And if you look at the stats, and it seems like the system may actually see another shift, and I think it may realign again how we are defining retirement now. Now, one key factor that I've already brought up, and that's why I'm bringing it up today on the show, is because I think this is the next 20 years of our evolution, is life expectancy. And generationally speaking, planning for retirement, like let's say you're in your 30s or 40s and you're talking with your parents about how they retired, and then maybe even your grandparents about how they retired, we have to today think much differently than prior generations because the concept of retirement, again, keeps evolving, especially when it comes to life expectancy. Now, I gave you some time periods a minute ago, so let me just go into those, right? From the 1700s, right around the Industrial Revolution to the mid-1800s, the life expectancy during those time periods was around 35 to 40 years old. Think about that for a second, okay? Now, at the time I mentioned the 1900s, around Social Security was established in the 1930s. By the way, not even 100 years ago, the life expectancy in that age range or that time period was about 58 years. At the end of 2023, not even a month ago, barely a month ago, right? The average life expectancy age is 79. Now, just stop there for a second. Just think about that more to that point. There's actually new studies, in fact, and research that actually is hypothesizing that over the next 20 years, we're going to see an incredible longevity-related breakthroughs that could add decades to your lifespan. Now, I don't know about you, we can go on a whole tangent on that, but here's what I mean by this when it comes to your money. We have to make sure that you're not outliving it. This, again, transitional thinking, okay? We can't think exactly how our parents retired because we may have a much longer time period to need our money for. So the idea of us living for 20 or 30 years in retirement might actually move to 30, 40, or 50 years in retirement, depending on two factors, right? Those many factors, but there's two main ones. One, what age you do end up retiring, and the two, if these breakthroughs in life expectancy and medical care and things like that actually happen. And so we may not have these things, but you sure should plan for it, which is why I'm bringing this up. And so understanding how this is going to affect your money has a lot to do with the success of your overall wealth, because today people are retiring when they are actually still fully capable of working. And that is where this chasm kind of comes in, because it ties back to declining workforces where people are either contributing to society or they're taking from it. And it's kind of the and/or situation here. And as we see advancements in healthcare and living conditions, and those add decades to our lives, we're potentially living longer. And that means our financial resources must last long enough to maintain our lifestyle. So how do you plan for retirement when the things like this are evolving? So this article that I mentioned, I really broke it down in 3 ways, and I'm going to use those 3 ways and expand on them. But the number one brought up, and I agree with this, is contribution. Now, this is not so much to do with money, but it has a lot to do with how we are looking at things in terms of your own life. Number 2 is prevention, and we're going to talk about that. And number 3 is delegation. So when I talk about number 1, contribution, I think about my grandfather, and I talk about to him every week. I've mentioned it on our show. He's 94 years old, but he always tells me, Bradley, a rolling stone carries no moss. And he has no reason to be in his yard every day, yet he is, because not that he's a huge garden person or something, but he wants to keep moving his body. And that's true of our physical body as well as our mental body. So when I talk about contribution, I think it's important to understand that if someone began working in their 20s, for example, and retires in their 60s, right? And let's say you live to age 100, okay? You think about that, you're retired as long as you were working. I say this often to my clients, right? God willing, we have the same amount of time on the job as we do in retirement. But then if you break that down even further, you actually just retired then at halftime. You played out your 2 quarters, okay, working, and you got 3rd and 4th quarter happening in retirement, okay? You're in retirement. So redefining the second half of your life, it's really about contribution. It's contributing to society, which I think, could mean a meaningful career, maybe a second career or hobby or business, even outside of your current one. Keeping active, being social, those things matter and they add up to making sure that we don't, get older right in front of our eyes, as they say, okay? And again, this is more of a non-financial standpoint to begin with. Then going to the second one, there's prevention. Now, from a prevention standpoint, I think that in life, as we know, there's risks, all right? There's calculated risks that we kind of address, and then there's just dumb risks that we don't even know happen and we just take it on. And regardless of where that line may be in the sand and the risks in defining, either side being wrong, these risks magnify over time. There's a ripple effect. In fact, there was a book I read recently, actually read a couple times. It's a fascinating book called Atomic Habits. Many of you probably heard about it, by James Clear. It was a New York Times bestseller. I read it a couple times, and it's a fascinating book. I highly recommend. In there, they mentioned something that actually my sister, who happens to be an aeronautical engineer, I addressed this with her, and she's like, yeah, that's totally right. Math checks out. So he made the analogy in one of the chapters that if a plane left LAX heading for JFK in New York, if the nose was tilted by about 3 degrees, by the way, you wouldn't even see that. It'd be unnoticeable to the naked eye. This seemingly innocuous, insignificant change you wouldn't think matters, but if you ran it out over the course of the country in this flight, you are off the mark by thousands of miles. You would land in Washington, D.C. versus New York. And in my context here of prevention and this ripple effect, I'm bringing up longevity. What I'm trying to share here is the distance in this scenario is, and as people live longer, they're spending more in retirement, which has the potential to strain your resources and increasing the possibility of falling short, let's say, of your destination, which is a sustainable and successful retirement. So your risks that you take on, whether it's in the market risk, interest rate risk, whether it's in just life risks and what you're doing in traveling, those are important because the ramifications, they magnify over time. Now, it's important to understand that when you talk about your assets when it comes to prevention, everyone has this rule of thumb, right? Like you're supposed to get more conservative as you get older. I actually tend to argue that often, because if you retire in your 40s or 50s or 60s, let's say, and you do have, we do see advances in healthcare and we're living longer, then you're managing your assets and your retirement assets for the long haul. Now, I've never run a plan in the 20 years of being a financial advisor, which for thousands of plans we've run, I've never run a retirement savings plan for a client saying, Brad, let's run the retirement plan for only 1 year. It doesn't happen. Like, why would someone want that? Okay, we don't want that to happen. So managing and understanding your risk, not just in investments, but like your cash flow, your debts, all the things you're taking on, has a lot to do with preventing your life and outliving your money. Lastly and thirdly, I want to bring up delegation. Every time I hear that word, I don't know about you, but I think of Ronald Reagan's quote, and it's, find the right people, build trust and relationships with those people, and then delegate and remove yourself. Friends, retirement planning is a team sport. We're not playing tennis here or golf. Those are great sports, no shade there, but it's a team sport. And so I think it's important to understand that you have to have a team working for you. And I can only speak to One Capital as wealth managers. Our job is to be, in this team analogy, your quarterback, your head coach, your team owner, but we need wide receivers on the field. We need running backs. We have to have a line for defensemen. That's our prevention, right? We have to have defense and offense at the same time. Again, your head coach, your team owner. So, we're relaying things back to you on the field based on the goals and objectives that you said you want to get to. And again, creating, understanding how to build a plan helps you delegate that responsibility to the right players to make sure you're doing it correctly. And I'll end on this. Embracing this new paradigm and this evolution I'm mentioning of retirement, understanding the mental shift of realizing it's not your final day. I always tell people when you retire, it's not the end. It's actually the beginning to a new chapter. Not that I'm saying it shouldn't be celebrated. It should. Retirement parties are great. But again, using a sports analogy, right? You're at halftime, okay? There's a whole other half to be played. And understanding what happens in the second half of your life or in a game has a lot to do with the strategy and winning anything as important, if not equal to, the first half. So find that person, delegate the responsibility, understand to keep contributing to society and to your family and your communities, right? And find those prevention aspects to make sure your risks are being managed. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that today. If you did, make sure to subscribe to our show so you don't miss a single episode. And always remember to make your money matter.